Well, thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited about this session today. Jess, if you want to go to the next one, please. We have our great leader, Jess, joined by Jill Williams, who I'm also really excited to hear from, who's one of our board members, and also principal of Wide Angle Strategies. And they're going to be chatting with us today about how to facilitate a hard conversation. And I think that this is great timing considering the world that we're living in right now. A lot of hard conversations are being held. They need to be happening, but how do you have those conversations? And so we will hear from them and they'll leave time for us to ask them some questions. And then we will leave some time at the end to chat with you all about some next steps and some future meetings coming up. So as always, if you aren't speaking, if you could please mute your mic. And if you do have a question, if you could use the chat feature, I will be monitoring the chat today since Jess will be presenting. And with that, I'll let you guys take over.
Great. Well, thanks, Ashley. Thanks everybody for being here, and thanks so much to Jill for joining me this morning on this, because I think she's probably got even more fantastic background in facilitating conversations. So we are going to tag team a little bit through our experiences in facilitating hard conversations. Particularly kind of larger group conversations, either with community stakeholders for a project or community issue, or with members of a board, for example, board retreats and board meetings and group meetings, and what we've found to be useful for that. Jill, do you want to say anything introductory before we get started?
No, let's jump right in.
All right. So the first thing we wanted to do is kind of get some feedback from all of you and understand a little bit, what do you all think makes conversations difficult? So take a minute to drop your answers in the chat and kind of take a look at those. And Ashley can report to us all the good stuff you're saying.
Political learning.
Yeah.
Unknown context. Personalities, finding the right words to articulate in your thoughts, lack of trust, being sensitive and conscious of people's feelings, thoughts, and ideas when there's already contention around the subject.
Those are all really, really good.
Lack of trust.
Lack of trust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Assumption on what other people might be thinking, your own political climate and real world experiences.
Mm-hmm. Those are all excellent, excellent reasons for why conversations are difficult. And I think a lot of it does really come down to lack of trust and lack of context, and kind of setting the stage, as well as thinking in the moment about how you handle those things to be able to build trust, or at least to acknowledge when trust isn't there. Any other ones that came in, Ashley?
Perception of criticism and not support, correction of guidance, talking with volunteers about any problems and helping those volunteers to best fit for interest.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I might have missed a bunch came in quickly, so I apologize if I did miss any that came in, but they're all really good. Historic traumas as well just came in.
Yes, very good. So I wish I could say that Jill and I are going to be able to address all of those things in a very neat way, so that you can just take them as a handbook and apply them to your setting. But of course, all of these things are based on human interaction, and that can be difficult to navigate. And so a lot of this is around just thinking, what's the best way that you can plan for, and then think about in the moment how you can make folks feel as comfortable as possible during difficult conversations. So Jill is going to walk us through first kind of the work that can be done in advance of the conversations in order to figure out how you can can build some of that trust and be able to address some of the things that you all talked about. So Jill, I'll turn it over to you and just yell at me when I need to advance a slide.
Okay, sounds great. It's great to be with you all today. Just as a word of introduction about myself, that's relevant here is that I grew up in Pulaski, left for college and didn't come back for 20, well, I came back to visit, but didn't come back fully until for 20 years. And while I was gone, I had a lot of experience helping other people figure out how to navigate difficult conversations, designing meetings, and so forth. When I told my mom that I was going to pursue a master's degree in conflict resolution, she said, Jill, you cry when people fight. Wondered if that was the best idea. And she wasn't wrong. I am very sensitive to conflict, both overt conflicts and maybe even more so those under the surface unspoken conflicts that you can feel in a room. What I explained to her at the time was that was precisely why I wanted to become a mediator. I had a whole speech about how I wanted to use that sensitivity that I'd always seen as a liability and turn it into a superpower. And that all sounded really great. But unfortunately, it turns out that I'm not a superhero. I think a superhero mediator is maybe what Jess is going to be talking about later, somebody who can turn even the most heated conflict into an empowering experience that ends in increased trust and just outcomes. But unfortunately, it turns out I'm not able to do that, at least not always. Sometimes I get lucky. I don't cry when people fight anymore, but I do still kind of turn inward when unexpected conflict arises, especially if I'm facilitating the meeting. After the fact, laying in bed after a meeting like that, I can always come up with amazing ideas of what I should have done in the moment, but I rarely come up with those great ideas in the moment. So instead of being a superhero, I've accumulated 20 years of experience preparing for difficult conversations, identifying patterns of what tends to go wrong in those conversations, and creating and tweaking interventions to address them. I'm going to share about 6 recommendations that are kind of packed, or ideas or guiding principles as you think about preparing for hard conversations. Given what you said in the chat here, I hope that some of what I say is going to be relevant to what you have in mind as you come in here. If you could advance the slide, Jess, that would be great. In order to keep myself focused and not give you the background on dozens of conversations that I've planned like this in the past, I'm going to focus my examples here on one case study that's most recent. Unless you don't watch, read, or listen to the news and are not on social media at all, you're probably aware that earlier this year, a public debate about equity in schools was alive and well. The buzzwords attached, you don't need me to tell you what it is, but the buzzwords were critical race theory and equity. And people were showing up at school board meetings all across the country angry about these issues. And Pulaski County was no different. Our school board meetings are normally kind of empty. If you don't have business there, most people don't show up. That was the case even before COVID. But in the spring and summer, we had hundreds of people showing up at our school board meetings arguing against critical race theory, protections for transgender students, mask mandates, and some people coming and arguing for Second Amendment rights and prayer in schools. Our public comments periods included personal attacks on our school superintendent, threats for violence, calls for violence. A pastor threw a Bible at the school board, and lots of Bible verses were read. This arose amidst a robust plan that had originated early in Pulaski County schools. So we had a robust plan for equity that we had been working on as a parent in the community and lots of other community members to work on some pretty severe equity issues we had here in Pulaski County schools. But the uproar that was happening was really threatening to derail those plans. And so a group of us got together in the spring concerned. Some of us were more concerned about it derailing the big plans for the school system. And some folks were concerned just about the tenor, the tone of those conversations being really unhealthy. I think all of us were concerned about that. And out of these small group discussions grew we're very generically at this point calling the community conversations about equity in Pulaski County schools. We have a planning group of about a dozen people who have so far convened 2 community-wide meetings that have drawn in about 50 participants with a wide range of perspectives on equity and what our schools should or should not be doing to address it. What I'm going to share are 6 guiding principles or suggestions that I've developed over a wide range of conversations, but I'm going to apply them just to this case study. I'm happy to talk about other experiences all over the country and with any of you who are interested, but today I'll focus on the Pulaski County equity. All right, Jess, if you could thank you. So the first 3 recommendations I want to share are around how you prepare for these conversations. So around transparency, I want to ask if I didn't realize you all stayed silent. So just nod your head, or I'm going to assume you're all nodding your head vigorously when I ask this question, which is, have you ever been invited to an event but can't tell who is planning the meeting? And I'd say that, you know, if you get an invitation to a meeting, but you don't know who's planning it, if it's a baby shower or a wedding shower, that might not be such a big issue. You might still show up. But if the invitation is to a conversation about a political hot potato of a topic that's ripping communities and families apart across the country, I don't know about you, but I'm not going anywhere near that meeting if I don't know somebody or if I don't trust somebody who's playing some convening role. So in Pulaski, for these community conversations, the small group of us who came together at first realized that we wanted to have community conversations, but we also realized that we didn't represent the diversity of thought or backgrounds of everybody we thought it would be useful to attend these meetings if they weren't just going to be echo chambers. So we intentionally created a list of people to invite to join our planning group. We intentionally looked for people who defined equity differently. And who had different opinions about critical race theory, transgender rights, and what role schools should or should not be playing in addressing these issues. But we all agreed that the tone of the school board meetings was not productive or healthy, and we all agreed that we wanted to see all Pulaski County children be as successful as possible in school. Together, this larger expanded planning group designed a meeting that we hoped would get people out who represented the diversity we had in our planning group. We were clear in our invitations to the meeting about who was on the planning committee. Since Pulaski County is fairly small, and since our planning group included people from across these different racial, generational, geographic, socioeconomic, political, religious, and other dividing lines, we figured most everyone in Pulaski County at least knew of one of the people on our planning committee. And we think that diversity and transparency about that diversity is what resulted in a larger number of people attending that first meeting, and really more of a diversity of people attending. Our youngest participant was 16 years old and our oldest was 90. And then we had all other types of diversity there. We were also clear about who was not on the planning committee, and that the people who were not on the planning committee was the school board or our school system leaders. We were clear that we wanted this to be a community-driven initiative. We wanted people with varying degrees of trust in the school board to feel comfortable coming to the meeting to join forces, even our planning group had different levels of trust in our school board. But we all agreed that having more sustained community involvement and attention to issues of equity in the schools was important in the long run. So that's one way to build transparency into a meeting. In terms of accountability, I don't know about you all, but I've been to so many meetings, and I try not to go to these meetings in the future, where people sit around generating ideas about things that should be done, but then nobody actually follows up on them. And I've also been to meetings where I can tell people are being quiet, sometimes more so in Pulaski County and the New River Valley than elsewhere, but people kind of stay quiet. And I think it's because of fear that something they say might be used against them in the future or taken out of context. And so in our situation, in our case study, we issued invitations to the community meeting and were clear that all of the ideas that were shared in the large group would be shared with our school board. But we were not going to share names or identifying information with those ideas that were shared and that feedback. That was important for us to attract and help teachers, for example, to feel comfortable coming to these meetings. Let's see, we also had ground rules around what we meant when we said things would stay confidential. So I just want to close this one by saying transparency and accountability are going to look different in different contexts. But I really think if you're working on issues that are important and controversial, and if you want people to join you who don't already agree with you, it's really useful to think about how to build transparency and accountability into your process. The next recommendation is around preparing participants. Okay, and I'm going to ask this question anyway. How many of you have been invited to meetings because you represent a particular constituency or perspective, only to show up and not have enough information or confidence to meaningfully participate in a meeting? I'm trying to see who, I can't see many people, but nod your head if you, okay. And then this next question is even harder, and that is, but you got to be honest. How many of you have invited someone to a meeting because they bring a diverse background, but you realize in the moment that you haven't done a good enough job of preparing them to participate fully? I'm seeing some heads nodded here. I used to be a program officer at a foundation, and the conversation I always hated the most was asking our grantees for feedback on our grant making processes. I was pretty clear, having been a grantee, I was pretty clear that the power imbalances in that relationship really made a true conversation and dialogue and getting feedback basically impossible. It's even more impossible if you're asking want-to-be grantees of your foundation about your grant making protocol. Power imbalances in meetings like this aren't always as obvious as those between a funder and a grantee, but they're always there. There's not really a way to erase them in the short term, but as a facilitator, I think there's something, it takes time, but there's some things you can do to minimize or to prepare those coming into the conversation whose voices are most likely to be marginalized. One way we did this in our community conversations was to have one-on-one conversations before the meeting with some of our high school students who were coming, trying to help them think through what they were comfortable sharing in the meeting, and what maybe they shouldn't be comfortable sharing in the meeting, but really preparing them so they knew what was going to happen. We also had similar conversations with people who we knew were coming with dissenting opinions about equity in the schools, specifically those who had publicly expressed opposition to critical race theory and so forth. Some of those folks were really concerned that if they showed up to the meeting, they were going to be called names or otherwise yelled at, and we had to put their minds at ease about that. The next suggestion is around setting clear expectations. These big conversations, some people might come into these conversations thinking success means everybody else walks out agreeing with them. Some people might come into the conversations thinking that if you do anything less than solve institutional racism, for example, in this 2-hour session, that it was a failed effort. So I think it's really important to be very clear about what your goals are, what success would look like. In our community conversation, the way that we handled that. Can you hear me still? Okay, thanks. The way that we handled that was to be really reasonable about our goals. Our goals were to better understand each other's perspectives. And then we set a reach goal that it would be really nice if we also could generate some consensus around a community-derived definition of equity. That meant that I think we did walk out having understood each other's perspectives, but more importantly, stating that at the beginning of the meeting, that that's our goal, I think helps everybody feel a little like the stakes are a little lower, and that they can fully participate. And if they're expressing dissenting opinions, it's not actually going to keep the meeting from being successful. Jess, can you advance the slide? The next three and last three suggestions that I'm going to share this morning are around what your agenda, what you might want to have your agenda include as you're designing the actual meeting. The first recommendation is identifying shared value or shared values. Again, this looks different depending on the topic of your meeting. In Pulaski, for our first community conversation, we thought an easy icebreaker would be inviting the 50 or so participants to raise their hands if they wanted to see all Pulaski County children be as successful as possible. We thought people walked in, their jaws were clenched, they were gearing up for a fight. We had fun music playing and trying to set the tone for a more lighthearted, not lighthearted conversation, but a friendly conversation. And we asked that question, raise your hand if you want to see all Pulaski children be as successful as possible. And everybody but one person raised their hand. So even though that didn't work, we anticipated having consensus at the beginning of the meeting. We did have one person who was a teacher not raise her hand. But that gave us good information too. I ended up going and positioning myself right next to that person. And she ended up softening up a little bit by the end of the meeting. So identifying shared values, trying to get everybody to buy into them can be useful. Another way that we did this at our first conversation, we asked all participants to bring a photo of their child or another child or children that they were thinking about in these conversations. They introduced their small group to their child or children that they brought photos of. And we left those pictures on the table during the conversation. And I think this did two important things, at least two. One was to humanize each other, to realize that we're not all just coming in because, you know, politicians are telling us that this is something important, that we really do have these children at the center. And then it also helped, I think, everybody to see that even though their child was there and was very important and on their mind, there were a larger group of children that we have to think about. And having their faces staring back at you during the meeting it can be powerful. Next recommendation is about this is the one that I feel most strongly about too. It's about using local data and local stories and getting everybody on the same side of the table, the proverbial table, with the data on the other side. Part of why I think politically divisive topics can be so toxic is because they happen, the ones that were critical race theory, the things we were talking about, and so many others, as Meredith said in the chat, they're happening on a national or even international context. And it's hard to see because our newspapers, resources, reporters are dwindling. It's hard to see how those issues play out in our local contexts. For example, in Pulaski and maybe in the larger New River Valley, Southwest Virginia, most of us didn't grow up being taught about the history of Jim Crow racism and segregation or slavery in the New River Valley. And so if we don't understand that history, it's easy to understand why we might assume that issues of institutional racism might be relevant elsewhere, say in the Deep South. We don't think that those are things that are relevant here. So I think it's crucial that we ground our conversations in local stories. We didn't, in our community conversation, spend a lot of time talking about the history of equity in our schools. But this conversation really took place in Pulaski. We've been having a larger conversation for the last couple years about the history of the Calfee Training School, which was the African-American school here in Pulaski during Jim Crow segregation. So there was, and the school board had discussed that quite a bit during their deliberations about our equity initiative. So I think people were more firmly aware, more grounded in what that history looked like here and how that might connect to present day issues. We did look at local data points around present day local data points. One was that Black students in Pulaski County are 2 to 4 times more likely to be suspended from school than white students for the same offenses. And so while we might disagree on what should be done to respond to this data, it's hard to say, or most people at least wouldn't be willing to say, that we shouldn't do something about it. And so that's an example of getting a local data point to show that these issues are not just national and relevant in urban areas, but relevant here too. Another way we grounded the conversation in our local context was to ask the groups to imagine a hypothetical scenario around equity. That scenario we came up with was very Pulaski County centric. It was a fishing competition. In our hypothetical situation, we said that there was a fishing competition. The traditional rules had been that whoever caught the most fish won. But we asked the group to imagine 2 children, one whose parents had bought her a fancy bass fishing boat and all the best equipment, and one whose parent who was fishing from the side of the lake with a cane fishing pole. We asked the groups to imagine they were trying to figure out a way to make the fishing competition more equitable. And their task was to come up with rules that would be more equitable. And I have to say, the conversations that the small groups had were amazing. They came up with things that our planning group didn't even imagine they could. A couple of the groups questioned the value of a competition at all and wondered why the kids couldn't work together to catch fish. Another group or several groups created really complex plans about how they were going to start teaching community fishing lessons at an early age to children, you know, practically from birth, and talking about how they were going to finance this and get to all the kids. And another group decided they weren't going to focus on either of the two children we asked them to focus on. They focused on a third child who they imagined never even made it to the community fishing competition because their parents worked on the weekend and they didn't have transportation. So all of these conversations were incredibly useful, I think, to get at the issues of equity, but stripping away some of those code words and concepts that make it difficult for people to enter those. And I think it was important to create a scenario that was culturally relevant to our region. Our evaluations, I'm sorry if you all can hear my dog in the background, she's having a fit. Evaluations from the meeting indicated that nearly everybody who participated, actually everybody who participated who filled out an evaluation left with a more a deeper idea of what equity could look like in our schools. And that fishing competition example is what we spent a lot of time talking about. Final recommendation is around mixing it up. And I learned part of this suggestion the hard way. I'm an introvert and I'm much more comfortable working in small groups. And I used to over rely on small group discussions when I was planning meetings, especially difficult conversations. But time and again, I've had facilitated small groups where you have one or two prophetic voices in your group who have amazing ideas, but when they get translated in a small group or a large group report out session, they get watered down or they don't get reported out at all and they really lose their power. To bring that point home, I was thinking about it last night. I was imagining if Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech in a small group, and then the designated note taker was supposed to translate that to the large group, we would have lost out as a society if we had limited those conversations to small groups. So I really recommend creating opportunities for both small group discussions. Small groups still important. You can't do everything in large group because there are people who are more comfortable sharing in small groups. But give time for large group processing and not just a report out in the large group processing. This is, I think, good general practice, but it's especially important for difficult topics. Sometimes people just need to feel like they've been heard before they can open their minds to moving forward and working on solutions. Final recommendation on this is to communicate in multiple ways using diverse media. Sharing local statistics is important, but we've all seen how if you just share a statistic, it can just reinforce what we already think about a topic. For example, the point I shared earlier about Black students being 2 to 4 times more likely to be suspended than white students in Pulaski. I hear that statistic and I immediately think, oh, wow, we've got to look at our discipline process and figure out what's going on and what kind of biases our administrators have or whatever. Other people hear that and might think, well, of course that's the case because Black students are 2 to 4 times more likely to break the rules. I want to be clear that I don't think that's the case, but some people that just reinforces their notion. So it's important, I think, to combine stories with those statistics to put them in context. I also think theater, storytelling, art, and music access different parts of our brains than facts and figures do. So in our second community conversation on equity in Pulaski County, and I could do a whole nother workshop on what we did with that one, but I won't. I'm just going to tell you one example. We invited Adair Theater, which is a local theater group, to come and share some excerpts from their play Quiet Courage about the history of the Calfee Training School here. And that set a different tone for a meeting. But there's lots of ways you can do that. After we had the excerpts, we had parents share stories about their challenges of advocating for their children in the schools. And both of those combined, I think, set the tone. But music or art or other types of theater workshops, all of these things, I think, can access different parts of our brains that make us approach things more relationally and less than talking points we're getting from the news. So I totally am aware that it's not always possible. Not everybody has all the time to think through all of these principles and incorporate them into their difficult meeting plannings. And I sort of want to close by saying, if your organization or community is having these difficult conversations, I think you should congratulate yourself because these conversations usually sit right under the surface, and only the people who are most harmed by them are aware of them. So if they've broken through that surface, I think you're doing something right in your organization or community. It definitely doesn't feel like it in the moment when they come up, especially if you're in charge, but consider yourself in a good place. And let me pass it on to Jessica, because I've talked too long here.
No worries whatsoever. So Jill, thank you so much for that. That was, everybody, just an absolute masterclass in planning for a difficult conversation. And I think that the extent to which, when you know that you may have a difficult meeting coming up, whether it be with stakeholders or board members, the extent to which you can put some of those things in place early is obviously going to be hugely helpful in being able to navigate that meeting. But at the same time, we all know that no matter the planning that goes into these, there can be really difficult moments within meetings that we don't anticipate. And so much of my experience in this area has been working with different nonprofits. Oftentimes the foundation will be asked to come and help facilitate a board retreat, for example, or work with a group of stakeholders that may be working with an organization. And even though a lot of times there's some good planning that goes into that, there's also the need often to be able to pivot in the middle of the conversation and really respond to what's happening in the room. So I'm going to share a little bit of kind of what I've found to be particularly useful in those moments. They're not necessarily going to fix every problem. These are difficult conversations to have, but things that I've found kind of useful as a facilitator. So first and foremost, when you're in a meeting and you can kind of see things going off the rails a little bit, right? Things might be getting a bit contentious between participants. Certain voices might be dominating. The first thing that's always helpful is to really go back to what kind of planning you have done in advance. And this is why sometimes, we think of icebreakers or setting ground rules at the beginnings of meetings as just kind of something you do quickly and then get through that to the meat of the meeting. But they really serve as a backstop when you're dealing with more difficult conversations. So first and foremost, when things start to get a little bit more contentious, I often try to bring a group back to those shared values that Jill talked about already. What are those things that we all agree upon and that we agreed upon at the beginning before things got contentious? And can we go back and revisit those and reaffirm those as a group? Because ultimately that's what brings the group together and helps focus the conversation. Similarly, thinking a lot about the goals and expectations. So is the conversation that is coming up, say when things are getting more contentious, is that moving you toward your goal or not? Obviously, folks are going to have different interpretations of how to get to a particular goal, but I think it's helpful to go back and try to revisit what is it we wanted to accomplish during this meeting, and is the conversation that we're having here going to help us do that by the end of the meeting? Or not? Or is it a conversation that needs to happen that we didn't necessarily anticipate? In which case it might be appropriate to give it some time. And we'll talk about that in another minute. It might be appropriate to give that some time, but also to think about how does that, can we all agree then that maybe we want to give time to this particular conversation and rethink some of what to expect out of the meeting? The next thing that I often recommend is to use a parking lot. You've probably heard this and facilitated things before, but it is often nice to be able to capture somewhere visually issues or questions that are coming up that may be tangential or unrelated, but still are important to the people in the room. As Jill said, oftentimes people that are in the room and have something that they want to bring up, they want to be heard. And you need to sort of have some evidence that they were heard. So having a parking lot where you can say, okay, I'm going to write this down so that we can all see and acknowledge that this was shared and we need to revisit it. You also need to be clear that you are indeed going to revisit it, right? So it's one thing to have a parking lot and say, well, I'm just going to put it here and, that's just to shut this person up. But you really do have to be clear that what goes into the parking lot is going to be revisited later, whether it's within the meeting itself or by the planning team or the leadership of the board that may allocate some time to address this particular issue and do so in a timely manner. But it's important to be able to capture that so that folks feel they're being heard. And then finally, sometimes you just need to take a break. So in community meetings or in lengthier board conversations, it's important to build in breaks in advance. This just gives folks some time to kind of reset, but it also gives them a little bit of time to network with one another and work the personal relationships that they have. You want to build those in advance, but you also need to be thoughtful about when folks might need to take a break. And so are you seeing, for example, that the energy in the room has gone down? Are you seeing that folks are getting increasingly frustrated? Sometimes you need to say, okay, let's take a 5-minute break and just kind of reset. What you do have to think about a little bit in those situations, though, is you don't want to take a break in order to just give folks time to have those kind of, side conversations that are just going to rile them up a little bit more, right? So being thoughtful about, okay, we're going to take a quick break. Here's what we're going to do during that break time to just reset and try to set some expectations for the purpose of that break. So those are some of the things that you can do sort of as things get contentious or you're having kind of difficulty in the moment. But I'll be the first to admit that oftentimes that stuff just doesn't work. So you may try as hard as possible to bring folks back to what we've agreed upon at the beginning of the meeting, but that doesn't necessarily ease the tension. So there's a few common things that I've seen over and over and over again, a lot of times at board retreats and even at broader stakeholder meetings that I wanted to bring up and kind of talk through how you might navigate them. This is not meant to be exhaustive, but these are the ones that I see kind of come up frequently. So the first is the idea of digging up the past. And so oftentimes, particularly in the context of boards that I've worked with where they may be at a transition point, it might be that they are searching for a new executive director, or it may be that they're at a point where they're starting a new plan or trying to think about how they take on a major project. There will be folks in the room that will want to dig up the past, meaning they want to go back to what happened before, maybe rehash certain decisions rather than focus on the goals of the meeting. And there can be really important reasons that you would want to take a look at the past. So for example, looking at the past can provide that common understanding of context. And Jill referred to that with sort of understanding some of the data in Pulaski County. Similar to that, understanding the past can help promote empathy with other group members. So, you may have somebody who's been on a board forever or a long-standing staff member that is at a point where they're frustrated or tired about something, and helping to understand that can give some empathy and some understanding for that person's decision or a person's position, that really helps to be able to move forward. And then of course you want to allow folks to think through the past and how it informs present decision making. So if you've learned from an issue that's happened in the past in a community event, or if a board has done something in the past, can it inform what you do going forward? Because we always want to be able to use the past as a lesson and a way of understanding where you can go. But there are also times when digging up the past can really be harmful. Certainly if it's distracting from the goals of the meeting, that makes it difficult. We're not going to want to rehash past decisions and not move forward to what the group really wants to focus on. I've found that a lot of times it imposes a pretty singular viewpoint on the group as a whole. So one person's interpretation of what happened in the past can really dominate. That's particularly important when you have newer folks at the table. Maybe they're newer to the board, if it's a board retreat, or newer to these kind of community meetings. And their understanding of the past may be influenced by that single viewpoint. And so you want to kind of protect against that and say, okay, this is what we've seen in the past. might be an interpretation of it, but isn't necessarily what we all need to think of as what happened before. And then I think most importantly, and when I see it happen most often, is when folks use it to assign blame. So they want to be able to say this went on in the past because of so-and-so or because of X, Y, and Z. And I think that oftentimes that can create a lot more tension in the room, certainly. And we'll talk about blame next, but that can really take a meeting off the rails. So what do you do? And it's difficult, and a lot of this is about thinking in the moment, but you want to diagnose quickly. Is digging up the past going to be helpful to this group, or is it going to take us off the rails and create even more tension? If you feel that it's useful to have some of that conversation so that folks can be heard, that's great, but think about setting a time limit for that. So say, okay, we're going to kind of go back and think through how we got to this place. Let's take the next 20 minutes to do that and be very clear about how long that's going to take so you can then move forward again. So the next thing kind of related to that I've seen a lot is sort of playing the blame game. And this particularly comes up when we're working with boards facilitating retreats or planning sessions with groups. And a lot of time there's looking back to think about what went wrong in the past. So the first thing is to think a little bit about accountability versus blame, because we all want to make sure that we're holding one another accountable, whether it's in these community meetings or whether it's in a particular organization you're in. And so kind of positioning some of this as if it's accountability to say something happened in the past, maybe it was a mistake, maybe it was just an issue that caused some friction in the group. You may want to think about that and look at it to understand why it happened and what you can do now to avoid that same mistake in the future. And so if you're thinking about it from an accountability perspective, it can be quite healthy for the group. But oftentimes what I've seen is that the blame game is really more about freeing others from responsibility or accountability. So I'm not going to put the work in to raise money, for example, for my organization because so-and-so in the past really screwed that up, and now look where we are. And I think that can be really toxic for the group. So I found that having some redirecting questions on hand can be helpful, and that can be what can we learn from the situation to move us forward? So how does this just help us get to the goals that we've identified? Or how can we as a group protect against those issues in the future? Sometimes it helps just to acknowledge, hey, you know what? In the past, we didn't do that really well, and I wish we'd done better. But let's think about what we can do now, because ultimately you can't change the past. You just have to be able to learn from it going forward. And then the final one that comes up all the time, and I'm sure every one of you has seen this, is there are just loud and dominating voices in certain groups. This can happen at community meetings, it can happen in board meetings, committees, but there are just some folks who tend to dominate the conversation. And it's difficult to deal with and to figure out as a facilitator. There are a few things that you can do. Jill already talked about small groups, and I find small groups particularly helpful for two reasons. One, it allows those dominant voices to be tamed a little bit, so you have the ability in small groups for certainly smaller conversation, but for people who might be quieter to feel more comfortable speaking. But it also allows you to identify some common ideas or values. So if I'm working with a group where we want to think through, what are some goals for the strategic plan over the next few years? If each one of those small groups is bringing up the same kinds of things, then it shows a level of consensus that can be quite helpful to the group. And it might also, again, be able to demonstrate to some of those dominant voices, hey, multiple people are behind this particular idea that we're doing. The other thing you have to think through as a facilitator is the extent to which you're willing to make folks potentially uncomfortable, but in service to the broader group. So sometimes there are people who are quieter, and it's important to be respectful of people's boundaries. But you also want to think a little bit, is there somebody in this room as you're observing that looks like they might have a question or something on their mind that maybe was more active during a small group, but not as much during a large group? And And can you call on them in a respectful way to say, hey, I'm wondering what you think about this particular issue. Again, you don't, folks are going to be uncomfortable, and you don't want to push folks out of an area that they're not willing to go to. But at the same time, it can be quite helpful to draw out some of those voices that are a little bit quieter, to be able to provide a different perspective, or just to be able to demonstrate that you want to hear from more folks. And then finally, and something that I found incredibly helpful, is to notice some of the dynamics of the group. If it's a group that you work with all the time, you likely already know who are some of those influential or moderating voices. These might be folks that don't tend to speak up all the time, but boy, then when they do, everybody listens, right? And you can typically tell that even with a group that you're newer to. So if you want, you can think about those folks and how to use them strategically. Is there a time when you want to ask, a particular person, hey, what do you think of this issue? Or maybe during a break, you want to talk to that person and say, I'd love for you, as we kick off this next section of conversation, to talk a little bit about, what your group discussed or what you're thinking, because those moderating voices can help reset the conversation and calm those loud ones. All right, so finally, when all else fails, a few things that I have found helpful and kind of interesting and amusing sometimes when you've tried all these things is just to kind of step back and think of a few other small things you can do as a facilitator. So first of all, humor is fantastic. It can break tension. Obviously, you want it to be appropriate, but being able to inject some humor into a difficult moment can kind of allow folks to sort of step back and put what they're doing in that broader context. Do we really all need to be angry at each other right now? Or can we step back, take a moment to laugh at ourselves, and then move forward? The other thing that I found helpful is really to amplify those in the room who are modeling the values and the kind of culture that you want to see. This can be kind of similar to drawing out those influential voices that I talked about. But as a facilitator, I think it's always important to express gratitude and to be able to amplify those folks who are just really an important part of the group. Everyone is an important part of the group. But when there are folks that are really modeling those values and showing that leadership, being able to acknowledge that, I think, is helpful, and again, can help reinforce some of the values you talked about at the beginning of the session. I found that providing examples is really helpful to a group. So if a board is wrestling with a particular issue, I may bring in an example from another organization that I've seen and how they handled that issue. I think that helps groups to understand that they're not alone as they're trying to wrestle with these things, that there are models out there that they can follow, and also provide some distance between the group and the issue so they can really examine what that other organization did in that example, and then think about how it applies to them. Another one, which I added after a meeting I had this week, was around ignorance. So feigned ignorance is a really interesting thing. And I was on a call the other night with a group that had a pretty long and contentious conversation. And I happened to know that the questions that this one person was asking, she likely knew most of the answers to those already, but she was asking them and kind of feigning a certain degree of ignorance, in part to make a point. And I think while certainly in some cases that can be manipulative, I think that curiosity and kind of saying, well, what about this, helped to reset the conversation a little bit. And I found it impressive that that was kind of the angle that she took. And I've seen that in other cases as well. So sometimes asking questions as a participant or as a facilitator, even if you kind of know what the answer is, can allow for deeper discussion. And it might also be that you actually don't know the answer in the way you think you do. And then finally, humility is essential. It really should be everyone in the room, but certainly for the facilitator, to just understand when, you know, you're not a superhero, you're not going to be able to, as Jill said, solve institutional racism in one meeting, solve all the issues your board may have in a 2-hour period. It's just not going to happen. And so having some humility around that and just understanding, here's what I can do and here's what I can't. And it might be a tough meeting and you're going to get to the end of it and then you can just figure out where you want to go next. But being able to understand that you're just not going to convince everybody of how things should go is an important lesson to learn, and one I think over time gets a little bit easier to handle. So I just wanted to share very briefly another example that I had. As I said, most of my experience has been with board retreats. And so I worked with a group several years ago that had a very large board. And anyone that had previously served on the board could come and attend some of the annual strategic planning session that they had, which made it a little bit difficult because oftentimes we ended up rehashing a lot of things or a lot of blame was going around. But in one particular session, one of those influential voices that I talked about just kind of raised a question that completely diverted the entire agenda. I mean, just blew the whole thing up. While I had, you know, tremendous respect for him, I'm like, come on, man, you know, I had a whole idea here of what I wanted to do. And it really came down to all of these different things that this organization wanted to accomplish. Why aren't we doing this? And we set out to do this and we haven't done that. And we're really having a very broad sense of what the organization could do without a whole lot of thought about whether or not they should do it. So a question that I ask all the time with boards and kind of help to reset this group was, what is this organization uniquely positioned to do? And what can it do that others can't? So in this particular situation, this group had a very powerful board of directors. And by that, I mean, there were a lot of very influential names in the NRV on this board. Those relationships and the ability to utilize that leverage was important. And that was a strength of the group. And then also for them to think about kind of geographically, as well as in relation to other organizations, what they could do. And we talked a lot about, okay, it's great that you want to do all of these things, but are you best positioned to do that, or is XYZ organization? And oftentimes that helped us to be able to really focus in on what it was that this group could do and have the realization that, you know, it can't do everything as much as it may want to. So I do think in the end, it was a helpful conversation to have, but also one where I felt like I always have in my back pocket some kind of critical questions to ask. And this one in particular is the one that I always feel is helpful in working with groups or committees to be able to kind of redirect the conversation back to what's possible. So with that in mind, I think we've got kind of we're at the very end of our time, but I don't know, Ashley, if there were some particular questions that folks had in the chat as we just wrap up.
I didn't see any come in so far.
Okay. Any other questions or reflections from the group, or Jill, anything else you want to add?
I think I already talked too long, so I don't have anything else to add. I'm sorry we didn't have, sorry, I didn't allow for more time for discussion, but I'm always happy to, if any, Jess can send out my information, and if I can ever be helpful as you're planning difficult conversations, I'm happy to be a sounding board.
Great. Jamie, did you have something?
Yeah, I had a comment. I facilitate workshops for Braver Angels, bringing conservatives and liberals together, and so very common difficult conversations. And one of the things we find is in an all-day workshop during the lunch hour, after being together for a few hours, that's a real opportunity for people to bond over some of the stuff that they've learned in the workshop. So just emphasizing the importance of some social time. Sometimes it has to be managed, but it can be really valuable.
I just want to chime in. I think in the midst of pandemic time, I forgot that, but yes, food, breaking bread together is a huge opportunity for that. I totally agree, Jamie. Thank you.
Any other?
Jessica,
yeah, go ahead.
I think I've told you before that I covet some sort of new executive director crash course, right? And when we ever have the time to develop that, this would be really great to include. I think this was really wonderful and made me think back to some of the meetings that I've led and what I could have done differently or better. And so I really appreciate the presentation this morning.
Great, thanks, Laura Beth. Yeah, we need to work on that crash course, don't we? It would have been nice if we'd all had it at the beginning. Any other final thoughts or questions? Well, thank you all so much for being a part of this. Let me reshare real quick, and Ashley, you can just show folks the very last kind of what's coming up if you want to talk through that. Sure. Hold on a second.
All right, so this recording and all recordings are going to be posted to our website. So if there's someone that you all want to share this call with, we will be sure that it's posted on our website. I'm going to see if there's a way I can like edit out a section. Our next call is going to be on November the 18th, and it's going to be about investing. So there's going to be two parts of the call, kind of the personal investing, and then as an organization, if you should be investing. So we hope that you will join us for that call as well. And just as a reminder, we're going to stay on Zoom until the end of 2021. And we have a new page for all of our third Thursday nonprofit listening session calls on our website. That's a lot easier to navigate for you all. So thanks for joining us today, and thanks for sticking with us. And Jess, thanks for navigating that situation.
Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon.
Bye.